And let's begin. Let's begin this morning. First of all, I'd like to thank each and every one for being with us today, for being with us through the years, and for dedicating yourself to your spiritual growth, to your continued development of a deeper realization of and experience of the presence of God in yourself and in each other and in this world and in all worlds. You know, it's amazing if you think that that our understanding of gravity as a constant, even as flawed as it is, even though science cannot really tell us what gravity is, but our understanding of it was good enough that we can send, or we could send space probes to land on the moon, to land on comets, to circle the farthest planets in our solar system, to even send spacecraft now. For the first time, we believe, one of the Voyager crafts that was launched in the 70s may have actually passed out of our solar system. And we were able to do this because there's a constant in the universe. Even though our understanding of that constant is still developing, and it is still unfolding, it is there. And love is like that. There is a constant. There is a presence. There is the very isness of God permeating each and every corner of the universe, and perhaps universes, and each and every person, and each and every cell, every tissue of our bodies, each and every function of our physical being, each and every emotion of our psyche, each and every thought that we are aware of. If we will only stop to realize it, all of these things are permeated by the love and by the presence and by the peace of God. So what we want to consider today is, what is peace? And how can we experience peace to a greater degree? And how can we as individuals, how can we help the entire world to come into a greater expression of the peace that permeates everything? Now we know that life goes in cycles. We can see that all about us. That the sunset is followed by the sunrise, day after day. The winter is followed by the spring. The calendar completes a circle at about 365 days. That's because the Earth has moved in one full orbit around the sun in that period of time, and it has been doing so for billions of years. For billions of years, these things have been going on. The high tide follows the low. The moon completes its phases in about 28 days, and there is a rhythm to life. There is a continuation to life. Things are born, things are lived, things die, and new things are born. And there is this continuation, there is this cycle of life. And for the people who lived in the lush tropical environments where they were so connected to the cycle of life, there was no birth, there was no death, there was just this change, this constant change, this constant being in this cycle of life. And even though it seems like things are repeating themselves, and they may in fact in our experience repeat themselves over and over until we make a shift, we are really not in the same place that we were at this time last year. Even though we have gone through another solstice, the very sun that this planet orbits is not in the same place that it was last year. It has moved within the galaxy. And the very galaxy that our sun is in is not in the same place as it was last year. For it has moved within the universe. And how do we know that the universe is in the same place that it was last year? We have no way of measuring that, no way of knowing that. It is beyond the intellect's ability. It is beyond science's ability to see, but only to speculate that this universe may simply be one of many. So even though it seems like we have come full circle, we are in a different place. And as we go through this cycle of life through the year, there are times to reflect upon certain conditions in life, certain events in life. In the spring, we focus on renewal. In the fall, we can focus on the bounty of life. At the solstice, we can reflect upon the quiet of life and the promise of renewal to come. And it is also a perfect time of the year to reflect upon peace. Because as I said last week, people have taken in the crops, they have preserved the food, they have plenty to eat, they have taken in the animals and slaughtered the ones that they're not going to keep for breeding stock, and they have plenty to eat, and they stay in from the cold, and there's time to reflect. There's time of inactivity. It's too cold to go out and work in the field, and there's nothing to do out there anyway. So there's this natural time to reflect upon peace. And this is why around the solstice, we talk of peace. In the Christian tradition, Jesus is referred to as the Prince of Peace. And we even have peace as kind of a slogan for Christmas. So it makes sense to us then that as we come through, as we come through the liturgical year, that we stop towards the end of the year and we ask ourselves, what is this thing called peace? What does this mean to me? What is this experience of peace? And do I have the same understanding of peace today that I had a year ago, or 10 years ago, or 30 years ago? Have I simply come around one more time, or have I allowed the center of my orbit to move to a different place? And I'm now contemplating peace from a perspective that perhaps I didn't have just a short time ago. So even though it looks like we might be going in a circle and just repeating the same thing over and over, we're actually going in a spiral. We're going around in a circle, but we're going up in consciousness at the same time. We're rising up in consciousness, like a sailplane finds a rising column of air and makes a very, very tight circle within it. From the ground, it simply looks like the plane is turning in the same spot. But with each churn, it gets a little bit higher and a little bit higher. So to me, this is what the evolution of our consciousness is like. We come around and we hit the same milestones, we hit the same issues to contemplate at different times in our growth. But as we do so, we're doing it from a different perspective, from a higher place. And that's why we want to take time out at the end of the year, or sometime during the year, but usually at the end of the year, to consider what peace is. What does it mean to us? What is the root cause of peace, if there is such a thing? How might I experience more of it, and why should I even try? Now, this time of the year, what happened in 1986 is John Randolph Price started what he called the World Peace Meditation, or the World Healing Meditation. And what they contemplated is the power of consciousness. What would happen if we as human beings could get together in consciousness at the same exact moment, everywhere on earth, at the same exact moment? What would happen if we human beings turn our attention to peace? And they decided that that moment in time would be at noon Greenwich time on the very last day of the year, December the 31st, which is coming up. Now they picked noon Greenwich time because at noon Greenwich time, that is the only instant of the day that the entire planet is on the same day. At every other instant of the day, any other time of the day, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, part of the planet is on today and part of the planet is on tomorrow. It just depends, or yesterday, it just depends on where you are and what you're looking, the way you're looking across the international dateline. But the Earth is usually experiencing 2 different calendar days simultaneously. Even though from space it looks like one little blue marble hanging out there in the void. Down on the deck here we've divided it into 2. But at noon on Greenwich time we are 1. See, at noon on Greenwich time the entire day, the entire planet is on the same day. So John Randolph Price founded what he called the Quartus, Q-U-A-R-T-U-S Foundation. And they decided in 1986, let's start this World Peace Meditation, this World Healing Meditation, in which we will invite people from all over the world to get together at the same instant in time and turn their attention to peace. And Lori and I discovered this in the late 80s, probably within 5 years after it started. We were living in Denver at the time, and of course noon Greenwich time is 5 a.m. out there. But we would get up in the morning and just be with consciousness, just be with peace, just turn within, just turn away from the ways of the world for a moment or two and allow ourselves to feel the peace that passes understanding. And it was a tremendous experience for us. There's a feeling that you could feel the palpable movement, you could feel the energy, you could feel something that was going on. And in one of these meditations, I very clearly saw the Berlin Wall crumbling, coming down, and I saw people walking from one side of the wall to the other through holes, and they were coming out and they were shaking each other's hand. And it was just like a vision, just like a flash that went before my eyes as we were engaged in this meditation. And a few years later it came to pass. Not exactly as I had envisioned it. You know, the faces of the people weren't the same, the clothes that they were wearing weren't the same, but in general, the wall was crumbling down. The cranes were lifting big sections of the wall out of place on TV, and people were coming through and they were greeting and hugging each other. And I thought, wow, the power of consciousness. I was able to tune into something, to see something that was happening in consciousness but hadn't quite unfolded yet on the planet. But I lived long enough to see it. And that was amazing to me. So I invite you, as we contemplate peace today, I invite you to consider whether or not this year on December the 31st, if you will take a few moments at noon Greenwich time, like I said, 7 o'clock here on the East Coast. But if you can take time to join the world, to join the millions of people around the world who will take that moment. And if you want more information on that, you can go to the website. It's quartus.org, Quartus.org, and just search for World Healing Day or World Healing Meditation, and they'll tell you more about it. But I bring that up because I want today just a couple of brief things about peace, because truly what peace is beyond understanding. Peace is beyond the intellect. It is beyond the words. It is really where the Hindus say that which is beyond words, but from which words come. Right? It is something that is already there. It is an experience that is already there that we must open ourselves up to. We must invite into our consciousness and into our lives. So we know that in our world, the world in which we live, in the Western world particularly, that everything seems to be broken down into a dichotomy, one way or the other. I used to laugh. We had a cartoon when we were doing organizational change, and the cartoon said, everything in the world can be divided into the dichotomy. The little boxes where they had, this or that kind of thing, or not this or not that. The little they called it the Johari Square. It was a little box of 4. It was a decision-making box. So everything in the world can be divided into 2 categories. There's that which can be divided into 2 categories, and there's that which is not, which cannot. So we try to take things in our way of thinking, and we try to make it one way or the other. We talked about this a few weeks ago in Greek philosophy. Something either is or it isn't, but it's neither both, or it's not. It cannot be not. It's got to be one or the other. And that's the way we have set up our rules of logic and our rules of thinking. And of course, those rules don't apply to the world in which we live. You could say it's either day or night, but you have twilight. you have time in between. It may be daytime and there may be an eclipse. It may be nighttime and the sky may be lit up for some reason with like the northern lights. There's all these kind of in-between things that the dichotomy of this way or that way don't quite fit. Is the tide high or is the tide low, or is the tide somewhere in between? Or is the tide slack tide in which it's neither coming nor going? When we learn to meditate, we learn to contemplate our breath so we can reconnect with that cycle of life. And we think, well, is our breath coming in or is our breath going out? Is it even our breath or is it just breath? Or is there a gap in between the breaths? And we learn to observe all of these things, and we find out that everything is in a state of in-between, usually in a state of flux, in a state of flow. And this Western way of thinking that something is either one way or the other really does not reflect the world in which we live. Yet we try to make the world that we live in fit into the box where something is either one way or the other. And I think what we do is we go through life, once we decide which box we're going to try to put things in, we go through life trying to delude ourselves that the world actually works that way. And of course, in order to do that, we have to ignore all the evidence to the contrary, which we as human beings are very good at doing. We just try to ignore. And of course, in the Eastern world, there's a different philosophy, and the philosophy says that something, it could be one or it could be the other, or it could be both, or it could be neither. There's kind of a broader understanding, a broader way of looking at life, and a broader way of looking at the world. And what I wanted to point out here is that this concept that we have in the West, really creates problems for us, because the life and the world doesn't work that way, and yet we try to delude ourselves to think that it does work that way. And we were talking in the Skype group a couple of weeks ago. There was a German mathematician who actually came up with a formula that you could prove to be either true or false. You know, and one of the guiding principles of our Western logic is that if it's true, it's not false. If it's false, it's not true. And here was something that was both true and false at the same time. Could be proven either way. And the man actually went insane. He actually had to be committed to a sanitarium, and he died insane. He went crazy, trying to figure this out. And the problem was simply his belief system. The problem was that he believed that something needed to be either one or the other, but could not be both at the same time, and yet in fact things can be. So my point here, the reason I bring that up is that when we come to this idea of peace, we look at the way that the world thinks, and the Western world that we live in thinks in terms of materialism. It thinks in terms of effect. I'm not talking about materialism in the sense of having stuff, although that is another definition of it. I'm thinking of materialism in regard to the idea that everything is like a mathematical formula. Everything is a chemical reaction. Life itself, it comes just simply from the chemicals here on Earth that somehow, through some sort of stimulus, somehow just started to organize themselves in a manner that developed life, that developed consciousness. And in our Western way of thinking, we are constantly looking at the effect, and we are taking it as cause. And we don't typically get ourselves back to cause. We're kind of always working in the way that things interact and the way that things seem to be. You know, when I went to school last year, I had to take some basic courses towards a degree, and one of them was psychology. And as the psychology book was going on, it was just simply talking about the average or the general way that things are. That's the norm. If the majority of people are like that, then that's the norm. And it seemed like a lot of what they were writing about was, well, how do you get the people who are out on the fringes, one way or the other, on the extremes of the norm? How do is that an illness? Is that a disease? Is that something that needs to be fixed? And how do we get people back into the norm? And the question that they never asked, that I was dying to see asked, is well, you know, what if the norm is wrong? Shouldn't the norm be changing, or shouldn't the norm be evolving? And why are we so adamant about trying to get people to be the same, which is defined as normal, when in fact it is just one way of many ways of being? But that's the mindset. See, that's the mindset of the world in which we live, that there are only two ways of doing things. There's my way, and then there's the wrong way. And that as soon as we can get everybody herd them into doing things my way, well, then we will have peace. Because in this definition of peace, peace is an effect. Peace is something external that is imposed upon the world when the world starts to do everything the way that I want the world to do it. That is kind of the human definition of peace. We will have peace on earth when everybody else lays down their arms. Now we need to keep our arms because there's dangerous people out there, but when everybody else lays down their arms, well, then we will have peace. We will have true peace. And of course, every nation, every group of people on earth is thinking exactly the same way. So in this human definition of peace, we have rising tension. We have the tension rises. It's almost like watching a drama on TV. There's rising tension between peoples, between nations, between between different religions. There's this rising tensions, and they come together and they just peak, and they get stronger and stronger, and then they just kind of explode into violence, into war. It's almost like the response of an addiction. You know, if you know people who are dealing with addictions, there's this tension. They have to have whatever it is that they're addicted to. There's this rising tension. They have to have it, whatever it might be. And then at some point they have to satisfy that craving, and they do in a big flash. You know, in some big way, in taking a substance or participating in whatever the addictive behavior might be, and then there's almost an exhaustion after that. There's this calm, there's this release. And we as human beings have come to believe that this calm is peace. So you see it in war. We go as nations, we go against each other, and we rise up, and we have this massive carnage, and we leave millions and millions and millions of people dead. And it's as if we say, oh my God, what did we do? You know, we can't ever do that again. World War I was the war to end all wars. We can't ever do that again. And of course we can see how that worked out. Because people back off for a while, and they just want to be in calm, and they just want to be in peace, and they don't want to go back to war. But over time what happens is that tension starts to rise again. You know, you look at the history of the world wars in Europe, and at the end of the First World War, the German leaders were brought into a railway car in France, and there they signed the treaty of surrender, the armistice to end the war. And that rail car was kind of set up as a museum. It's like a caboose, we would call it here, and it's on a little siding somewhere, and it's kind of like a museum where people could go and visit it. And less than 30 years later, when Hitler came to power, he humiliated the French by bringing them back to that very same rail car and making them sign the conditions of surrender in the same place. So the human idea of peace, the human perception of peace is that when everybody else stops fighting, we will have peace. But the human reality is that no such thing exists. See, even if everybody was just like us, we would start infighting. If you look at different fundamentalist groups around the world, whether it be a religious fundamentalist group, or whether it be a political fundamentalist group, or even a scientific fundamentalist group, a group of purists in some particular science, what you will find is that even though these people seem to have a common way of thinking, a common way of being, they start to find differences. They start to find ways of nitpicking each other. You saw this in the United States. You saw this as we go through the elections, as we went through the elections. You know, there were conservatives who were not conservative enough. So we needed to have even more conservative conservatives, or more liberal liberals. And what happens is people are not satisfied with the fact that now we are all kind of together in whatever that togetherness might be, but people continue to divide. They continue to struggle. Within religious groups, you start to see different groups breaking off, you know, and splinter groups. They'll fragment off. And what started as some type of a core movement now becomes multiple movements, and they get so fragmented that eventually they will wither away and die, because each one comes down to such a narrow view, a narrow way of thinking. So what happens is in our human way of thinking, our idea of peace is that peace is the absence of hostilities. Peace is the cessation of hostilities. Peace is that time when we have stopped struggling against one another. And this is kind of a fallacy, because we believe that peace is really imposed upon us by the external things. As long as everybody else stops doing things that annoy us, well, then we'll have peace. As long as everybody else stops threatening us, then we will have peace. Whoever we happen to be. This is the world in general I'm talking about. And of course we can never have that, because we are looking for something out there to come to us. And that is not what peace is at all. So in the Western world, we think of things in terms of the externals, of things being imposed upon us, of the way that we can look and analyze and weigh and measure the things out there, and we never contemplate what it is that we are looking with. We're so consumed with what we are looking at. And the idea of peace is this external idea of we can weigh it, we can measure it, we can touch it based on the fact that everybody else does something that we want them to do. And yet we know that that's not true, but our Western way of thinking says it's one way or the other, but it's not in between. And of course it is in between. It is in between. And then we have the spiritual view of peace. See, there's two ways that we look at things. It's either the materialistic or the spiritual. And of course, there has to be other ways. Our way of thinking makes it two ways. And in the spiritual way of thinking, which is the one that we want to talk about today, peace is not an external event. Peace is not something that happens when everything else out there goes the way that we want it to go. But peace is an experience of oneness. Peace is the experience of unity, of singularity. It is the complete harmony that exists between things that are just naturally parts of each other. As I said in the opening treatment, the air we breathe is the air that the plants exhale, and the air that the plants breathe in is the air that we have breathed out. And there's this harmony, and there's this synergy, and there's these two different parts of the same whole that are working together, that are cooperating together, and they are doing it at a subconscious level, Do you think the plants think that they're getting their air from us, or that they're giving their air to us? They just do it. They just simply be it. They simply are what they are. But they are part of a bigger picture. They are part of a bigger whole. They don't see themselves as isolated and insulated from us. In fact, they may not have a sense of self-consciousness at all. But there is something deeper that is working through both us and the plants, that is working for the higher good of both. And it is when we realize this oneness, when we realize this unity, we turn away from the events of the world, from the stuff that we see on TV, and we follow our consciousness to that center. We start to bring ourselves into this place of oneness. See, then we can start to experience the peace. So peace then is not the cessation of hostilities. It is not the absence of conflict. Peace is a very way of being. Spinoza told us this. It is a way of being. It is a way of living. It is an awareness of being alive and being connected to each and everything. So that this idea of harming another is as foreign to us as the idea of harming our own self. That we truly recognize that what we do to another, we have done to ourselves. That if we pollute the air that we breathe, that we are poisoning ourselves and we are poisoning our children. That if we try to rob from another, we have robbed from our own self. So rather than dealing in the world of effect, in the world of something out there has to change in order for me to be peaceful, we start to get this idea of peace, the spiritual idea of peace, the idea of peace that has been given to us by the great mystics of all ages, that peace is not an external event, it is an inner awareness. It is an inner way of being. It is consciousness. See, what is happening in the world out there, in the world of the external, in the world of materialistic thinking, is we are finally getting to a place of intellectual understanding. We don't know what to do with it, but we are finally getting to the place where we're starting to understand that hostility is caused by consciousness. We are calling them ideological wars now. We're not fighting nations, we're not fighting states, we're fighting ideas. And it is because people have different ways of thinking and believing, those ways of thinking and believing that deal in separation, in what is different and what is wrong, and my way is the right way and the only right way, that these beliefs and these ideas are the very cause of hostility. And you cannot fight them with guns. We try to. But it doesn't work. See, the ways of the world do not work because the ideas of the world are fundamentally flawed. We are looking for peace to come to us through external events, and peace is something that can only come to us when we change the cause of conflicts, which is the way that we as human beings believe. I was listening to a lecture by Joseph Campbell one time, and I wish I could tell you exactly which one it was. But he was talking about the Middle East, and he said, if you look at what is going on in the Middle East, you have three major ideologies trying to coexist: the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims. He says, in all three ideologies trace their origins back to the same place, to Abraham. This is why they are called the religions of the book. They all have a common origin. They all go back to the same intellectual place, but yet each has developed a different idea, a different way of believing about who and what God is, and what our individual relationship with God might be, or with the groups, the nations' individual relationship with God might be. And those ideas allow them to stay at war and at conflict, and they've been doing that with each other for thousands of years. If you go back and you look in the Old Testament at the origins, and you trace all the way back to the ancestry of, the origins of the Jewish people as the chosen people, and if you look at the ancestors of the Muslim people, you will find that there is a slur. There is a slur in the Old Testament. That the tribes that went on to become the Muslim tribes, that their ancestors were born of incest. And I never realized that. Rocco Errico was talking about it one time. And it is so subtle if you don't catch the culture, if you don't understand the culture that wrote it. It's like saying, those SOBs over there. The hostility goes back for thousands and thousands of years. It says those people, whoever those people are not like us. And what Joseph Campbell says, we're not going to see peace in the Middle East until people start to adopt a new idea of God, an inclusive idea of God. So what we're talking about then today is that peace, as we understand it, is not an external event, but peace is an internal way of being. And it is something that starts and ends in our consciousness. And this is why we have been told for thousands of years to do things that make absolutely no sense intellectually to our Western world, to bless our enemies, to pray for our enemies, to do unto others as we would have them do unto us, to turn the other cheek, to forgive. Not 7 times, but 70 times 7. And 7 was a number that meant completeness. As long as it takes to completely forgive, forgive. Because until you forgive, you will not have peace. So what we start to realize then is that the peace that we are talking about is the peace that passes understanding, because it is not an intellectual exercise. It is not a transaction. It is not something that says you sign your name to a piece of paper that says you surrender and now we have peace, because we know that that doesn't work. But peace is a way of being, of recognizing our unity, our oneness with everything. Peace is something that comes from and can only come from a change in our consciousness. And this is why we must engage in that change if we wish to experience peace. Now, I know what happens is we start talking about that and it becomes very easy to say, well, it's okay if I change my consciousness. Well, what about everybody else? Well, everybody else is responsible for their own consciousness. And we have to start with the only thing that we have to work with, which is our consciousness. And we cannot use the excuse that I'm not going to start until somebody else does. Which is basically like saying, I will lay down my arms after everybody else surrenders, you see. Or maybe I'll keep a few in case they get a little bit out of line again. We must begin where we are. We must work with what we have. We must do what we can with what we have where we're at. We must recognize then that the absence of peace, or the appearance of the absence of peace, is nothing more than a result of ideas of consciousness. And the best thing that we can do for our own self and for the world is to begin to change those ideas. To begin right where we are with changing the ideas of separation, to changing the ideas of differences, to changing the ideas of hostility, and allowing the ideas of the peace that passes understanding to have their way with us. Now, we have to understand that this works at 2 levels. You can read the experiments that I've been telling you about, where the Tibetan monks are working with scientists to understand the interaction of consciousness and the brain. And they find that they put the shower cap on these people with electrodes all over them. In fact, you may have seen Anderson Cooper did a report on mindfulness meditation showing how meditation changes the brain waves. He had one of those skull caps on. And they asked him to think of something disturbing and then to go back into his meditation. You could see the physical, you could see the change. You could see the change in the brainwaves. So what's important is the intention, the conscious decision to experience peace causes a change in the way that our brains function. And they're finding this with the experienced meditators, that as the monks who meditate on peace for hours each day, that their brains become rewired for peace. And that rewiring lasts much, much longer than the meditation period itself. So that by sitting for 20 minutes twice a day and meditating on peace and meditating peacefully and experiencing the peace that passes understanding, what you are doing is you are physically rewiring your brain to make you a more peaceful person, to make your experience of life a more peaceful experience of life. Now, this doesn't mean that bad things aren't going to happen around you. Everybody's on their own journey. Everybody's on their own path and progressing at different levels. And some people may not be ready for peace, and they may need to continue to experience the violence. Buddhism gives us an example of when two tribes were going to go to war, and the Buddha was able to intervene once and to stop it. But the second time he was unable. And he just watched, he just observed as these two tribes killed each other. But he was not distressed or disturbed by it. See, he was still peaceful. He had the realization that everybody was not ready to be peaceful yet, but he could still be peaceful and recognize that life was just unfolding upon itself. That everybody is in the process of learning and growing and evolving. And he did not require everybody to be where he was. He would show them the way, but he didn't require them to be there. So as we become more peaceful individuals, things may happen around us, but we are not disturbed by them. Because we are more peaceful as well. Because we understand that the whole world is not ready to jump on that bandwagon just yet. But that should not prevent us from doing what is inevitable for us. To set our intentions on peace, to do our spiritual practices, and to allow that peace to unfold. So the first benefit, of course, is to ourselves, to our experience, in that we can have a more peaceful life. And the second is to humanity in general, because we are individualized parts of that consciousness of the whole. That when we change consciousness that we can control, we call it our consciousness, but Dr. Holmes really tells it is just simply that part of all consciousness that we use. That when we begin to change consciousness, all of consciousness begins to change. That we are all connected, we are all entangled in consciousness. We are all woven together in consciousness, and that changing consciousness does produce changes in the world. World Healing Meditation, for example. But for other examples, you might wish to turn to Dr. Dean Radin. Dr. Dean Radin has wrote a series of books called The Conscious Universe, in which he demonstrates experiments where people who came together and focused their consciousness together, that had a measurable, tangible effect on objects in the physical world, on things in the physical world, such as random number generators. And of course, this is where we talked a few weeks ago, this is where some of the discussions in quantum physics are now going, which is the fact that people can meditate on light going through two slits and have an impact on whether the light appears to be a wave or a particle. The point is just simply this: when we begin to do what we can do with what we have, with where we are, all of consciousness begins to change. And in that regard, then we are the blessing. We are an instrument of God's peace. But we have to start where we are with ourselves. We cannot start by trying to fix another. It's like being on the airplane and the oxygen mask come down. We have to put our own on before we are fit and able to help another. So the things we want to keep in mind about peace are that peace is not an external event. It is a way of being, a way of living, a way of breathing, a way of experiencing life. And it starts and it ends in consciousness. It has nothing to do with the external events because they are effects. It has everything to do with cause, which is the way that we perceive ourselves to be one or separate from each other. And the way that we achieve it is to follow the advice of the sages, the Buddhas, the Christs, the mystics, the people of all ages who told us, be still and know God. Do your spiritual practice. Take your time to connect with your breath in meditation. And in so doing, recognize that you have just connected with all of life. Take your time when you take your meal to contemplate the miracle by which the soil becomes the plant, and then the plant becomes the food, and then the food becomes your body, and then your body becomes the dust. And in eating the meal, we are connected to everyone and to everything, to the people who grew it, to the people who picked it, to the people who processed it, to the people who transported it to the people who put it out on the shelves. We are connected to all of humanity with every bite of food that we take. And when we go within and we go in our consciousness and we go to meditate, we can recognize that at the level of consciousness, we are connected. We are one. And we are willing to do our sacred work of being that instrument of peace that the world has been looking for, but they have been looking in all the wrong places. So I invite you then, as we close out this year together, please take time to consider where you were a year ago with regards to your idea and your experience of peace. Where were you 10 years ago? Where were you 30 years ago? Where do you want to be next year? 10 years from now? 30 years from now? Dr. Holmes tells us that the world has learned all it needs to learn through suffering. It is time for the world to wake up and recognize that everything it experiences as a result of consciousness, and to begin to do the only thing that makes sense, which is to clarify and purify consciousness. Each and every one of you, each and every one of us is God's blessing to the consciousness of this universe, of this world, and of peace. So I invite you this week, particularly on the 31st if you care to join, but I invite you this week, please be that conscious instrument of God's peace that you came here to be. Because one by one, as our candles light, the world takes on a different glow. A glow of love, a glow of peace, a glow of unity. And so it is.